Nice, thanks.
Welcome, everyone. And I think congratulate our guests for having the best audience of the term. So well done. So really great to see you all here. And before I introduce Guy, just to mention this is the penultimate seminar of this term. And next term we have the final one, which is Professor Dominic Spracklin from Leeds University on Do Rainforests Create Rain? And looking at all the evidence from the Amazon about the fact that to the extent that forests can create and generate rainfall.
One of my heroes.
Fantastic. And so on to Guy, who he studied at Oxford as an undergraduate, did history at Merton, and then did a master's in sustainable development. And I think throughout his writings, what's really impressive about Guy is that he combines quite a deep understanding of nature and ecology with an understanding of land and land use history. And I think there's no one else in that space in the nature writing that I've come across in the UK, at least. So he's written a number of best-selling books, including Who Owns England? The Lost Rainforests of Britain, which is really seminal in kicking off a whole movement and thinking about the temperate rainforests of the west of Britain, and The Lie of the Land, which I think will be the focus of much of what is discussed today. And he has a new book in the works as well, we were discussing. But beyond that, he's also an activist, has worked for Friends of the Earth, was policy coordinator for Rewilding Britain, and was co-founder of the Right to Roam movement to expand public access to nature in England. So and so a big role in not only writing about nature, but in changing policy and our relationship to and access and rights around nature in the UK. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Guy, and over to you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Yudvinda, for inviting me and for a very generous introduction. And thanks very much, Stephen, for setting this all up. Thanks very much to all of you for coming. Can I just check, can you hear me at the back if I project like this? I don't want anybody to not be able to hear. I can put on microphones if useful, but just wave if I become indistinct. So thanks for coming today. This is my talk, Ill Fares the Land, Holding Large Landowners to Account for Nature Destruction and Restoration. And the title of my talk, of course, comes from a famous 18th century poem by Oliver Goldsmith, who wrote bitterly about the enclosure movement that was taking place in England at the time, and about large landowners who were enclosing not just areas of common land, but even entire villages to make way for have a nice view from their stately mansions. And the verse in his poem, The Deserted Village, that it comes from is, "Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay." So whilst there are lots of things that, of course, we need to be doing to reverse the nature crisis that we face, and many policy areas that need to be addressed, my talk today is obviously, of course, very much focused on this question of land ownership and trying to see the nature crisis through the lens of land ownership. And nature, of course, very much is in crisis, both globally and in the UK. But rather than start my talk with reeling off endless doom-laden stats about the decline of species and habitats that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, I just wanted to kind of start at the other end of the scale. I want to start with talking to you a little bit about the moments in which, for me, the depth of the ecological crisis has really hit home, which for me are moments when I've actually experienced the abundance of nature, such as visiting Martin Down National Nature Reserve on the Hampshire-Wiltshire border and being kind of bombarded by clouds of butterflies like these marbled whites or these beautiful dark green fritillaries, or just walking through 1,000 acres of chalk grassland and chalk heath and scrub, and just having this realization that this is something that used to be commonplace. We have these fragments now, protected as national nature reserves. This one is owned by Natural England, the government's nature regulator. But it's an example of something that used to be far more widespread. And nature used to be abundant, but we have made it rare. So let's turn to what is being done to restore nature. And just to be clear, the focus of my talk is on England, as that's the jurisdiction of the Westminster government, and it's also where I focused most of my research and campaigning. So the UK government, the Westminster government, has various nature targets. Here are, I think, some of the more important ones. An internationally agreed target to protect 30% of nature by 2030, also often known as 30 by 30. It also has various domestic targets under the Environment Act to restore or create 250,000 hectares of new wildlife-rich habitat by 2030, and to halt the decline in species abundance by 2030. And both of those are kind of interim targets towards slightly longer term goals that stretch out to 2042 of creating about 500,000 hectares of new habitat and increasing species abundance by a tenth. But in other words, we've got three stretching nature goals here for nature recovery that the government is signed up to, and they actually all fall in about 4 years' time by 2030. So are ministers anywhere close to reaching these three goals? Well, surprise, surprise, no, they are not. And just to begin with the 30 by 30 target, which was signed up to by the government some years ago when Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister, and it's internationally agreed by governments around the world. Quite embarrassing, really, I think, for the UK government to go into negotiating halls at the Convention on Biological Diversity and say, oh, we'd love Brazil to restore and protect the Amazon. Sorry, back home, we can't really be bothered to do our part for nature restoration. So how close are we to meeting 30 by 30? Well, the government themselves, DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, say that about 7% of the land in England is currently in a condition, both be protected and well enough managed for nature, that it should count towards the 30 by 30 goal. Wildlife and Countryside Link, a coalition of conservation NGOs, say actually it's more like 3% because they don't count triple SIs, sites of special scientific interest, that are in unfavourable or declining condition. I think it's worth just looking at this, apologies, slightly small map that you can see here of England. It's produced by the government, by DEFRA. They put it out to sort of look at areas where they think that land that is currently counting towards 30 by 30 shown in red, so some very small areas there, and areas that they think could count towards 30 by 30 shown in blue. And just to kind of note that, that encompasses all of the sites of special scientific interest, triple SIs in the country, but also a lot of the national parks and national landscapes. And a lot of them are in areas of the uplands or otherwise on areas of kind of coastline or some of the chalk downs that I mentioned earlier, where it's fair to say that it's land that is some of our least productive land for growing food. And we'll come back to some of that later. But let's zoom in a bit. Let's go to the North York Moors. North York Moors is a national park. The boundary of this is shown in blue here. It's got lots of triple SIs within it. Those are shown in green. And these are the sorts of maps that we're perhaps more used to seeing when it comes to habitat recovery. Lines on maps, seeking to protect this area or that area, trying to make the numbers add up to those targets that we were just talking about. But there are a different set of lines on maps, lines that denote power, lines that run through the countryside tracing boundaries of land ownership. And this is a map of who actually owns the North York Moors. And I don't know if you can read those names. I'll read out some of the names of the estates, but you can see that it's dominated by a small number of very large estates, running from the estate of the Duchy of Lancaster, shown in purple there, the estate of the King, through to land owned by an earl, two viscounts, the Forestry Commission, the Ministry of Defence, and the bloke who set up Carphone Warehouse. And so it's an eclectic mix, but they're all very, very large estates. And it's these boundaries, I would argue, that do far more to determine what goes on with the land in practice than, for example, the lines that we draw, particularly around national parks. Because what these landowners do with their land has a huge impact on nature. And in the North York Moors, these 15 estates, most of them are grouse moors. I'm not referring to these two photos here, but I'm referring particularly just to the newspaper clipping at the top there. And they use them for grouse shooting. They burn the moorland. They keep the peat bogs drained. They illegally persecute birds of prey, and this newspaper article in the Times from a few years ago is about a illegal killing of a goshawk, protected bird of prey, on the Duchy of Lancaster's land, then owned by the Queen. And this goes on estates like these across the uplands of England. In other parts of the country, the land use practices differ, might be different. They're in the fens, shown in the picture below. You've got intensive drainage for horticulture. In the wooded valleys of Exmoor, you've got heavily stocked pheasant shoots. But it's the lines of ownership, I would argue, that are really, really mattering there in terms of what goes on. And it's my argument that if we're going to restore nature, we need to grapple far more with the question of who owns land and how landowners are being encouraged, incentivized, taxed, regulated, or coerced into doing the right thing. Because, ultimately, you can come up with as many idealistic plans for how to change land use and to restore nature as you like, but if those who actually own the land don't really want to play ball or can't be compelled into playing ball, it's probably all a bit worthless. And that sign there is a lovely, one of my collection of keep out signs that I've kept. Conservationists not welcome here, on a gate somewhere in the countryside. So the question of who owns land in England is not an easy one to answer, because for centuries, this is a subject that has been taboo. The statistics and the details have been kept under wraps. I would argue often to protect private property rights. And you've no doubt all heard of William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book of 1086, his William shown on the bio tapestry. But I'll just do a quick show of hands. Who's heard of the second Doomsday? One or two hands, but mostly people have not heard of the second Doomsday. It was carried out far more recently than the original Doomsday Survey. It was carried out in 1873 by the Victorians, and its findings that 4,000 members of the aristocracy and landed gentry owned half of England at that time were sufficiently inconvenient to the governments of the day, who, when they commissioned them, thought it would show a much more democratic ownership of land. They quickly swept those findings under the carpet. But I think it's fascinating how that story, which was popularised at the time, there were books written about it. This book here, The Acreocracy of England, was a popularisation of the return of owners of land. Owners of 3,000 acres culled from Doomsday Book. He's not referring there, this is John Bateman who was writing this book. He's not referring to the original Doomsday Book, he was referring to the survey that had just been done in the late Victorian period, and yet it has been forgotten now. So I think that to me that illustrates some of the kind of secrecy and kind of around who owns land and how it's a bit of a taboo subject still. But having dug into this subject quite a lot over the last 10 years, I would argue that from numerous sources, that land ownership in England today remains highly concentrated and unequal. And my estimate is that half of England is owned by less than 1% of the population. And here's how I break it down in my book, Who Owns England? At one end of the scale, you have the aristocracy and gentry still owning maybe a third, 30% of the country. Homeowners down the other end there, all of the homeowners in England owning about 5% of the land. And in between, you have a variety of corporate control, newer money, public sector, and so on. And in fact, it's actually even more concentrated than I perhaps initially thought. Don't expect you to read all the tiny words on this slide. I just want to show you that I'm not making this up. This is actually official stats from the Department for the Environment. But in 2024, I requested some data from the Department for the Environment, that they released some statistics on farm size to see how many farm holdings there are over more than 500 hectares, or about 1,200 acres in size, and how much land they own or manage. And it turns out that just 2,500 farms control 26% of the farmland in England, which is about 18% of the overall land of England. So again, I would argue there that you've got this huge concentration, which creates, sets up interesting questions about accountability for me, and how do you hold this relatively small number of landowners and landholders to account for what they're doing with the land? Yeah, as I say, for decades, governments have treated questions around land ownership as somewhat taboo, and treated landowners with kid gloves. Even the Land Registry the official registrar of who owns all the land, remains both incomplete and locks behind a paywall that makes it prohibitively expensive to map who owns land. You can pay you used to be able to pay £3. Update my stats on this. You used to be able to pay £3 for an individual land parcel to find out who owns an individual parcel of land. That went up to £7 more recently. And, that might not sound too much, but there's 24 million land parcels registered in England and Wales. So it's now, what's that, £172 million, something like that, £160 million to find out who owns all of it. And as I say, it's also incomplete. It's still not been fully registered. When it comes to questions of nature recovery, I would argue that successive governments have relied heavily on voluntary action by landowners, more than they have on things like regulation or taxation. That they have parroted the preferred narratives of landowner lobby groups, that landowners are the benign stewards of the land or custodians of the countryside. And this is a quote here on this cartoon from, which I've put over the top of the original joke that was in the cartoon. This is former Environment Secretary Therese Coffey addressing the conference of the National Farmers Union in 2023, where she said, "I do believe our farmers are the true custodians of the natural environment of food production and our countryside." And the thing is you can go to Oxford Farming Conference each year, or NFU Conference, or the Conference of the Country Land and Business Association, and you can hear ministers and presidents making pretty much the same, using pretty much the same language. And I go into some more detail in The Lie of the Land about how this is the result of a concerted campaign over many decades by the farming and landowning lobbies to use this language, to foster this frame, and that every president of the NFU since the 1970s has used the phrase custodians of the countryside in their speeches. I argue that this is because it's a way of basically deflecting attention, saying, actually, it's okay, we've got this sorted, you don't need to worry about us, we can look after the countryside on our own, we don't need your regulations or oversight. And in fact, rather, what we'd like is some nice juicy carrots rather than some sticks. We'd rather have incentives and money rather than regulations. And we certainly don't want to open up the question of whether actually nature might be faring better under different forms of ownership, something that's been really completely taken off the table politically in recent decades. So what do I mean by some of these policy forms of incentive that have been promoted in recent years? I mean, one approach that's been tried for the past 3 decades or so has been the greening of farm subsidies, a shift from paying for food production under the old Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, and then later, as that was reformed, to paying farmers and landowners basically for the sheer amount of land owned and farmed, to what's been called environmental stewardship payments. They sort of began under the old European system as what were called Pillar 2 payments, branded as environmental stewardship. You see that word again in England. And then, of course, obviously more recently, since Brexit, there's been this development of a whole new farm payment system called ELMS, Environmental Land Management Systems. But when I was working on the book, and I did some work with Tom Lancaster, who's an expert on agri-environment payments, we looked back through the numbers and we worked out that about £9 billion has been paid to landowners in stewardship payments alone since the early 1990s. So that's not even including all of the area payments and then previously sort of production payments that were part of CAP at the time. So that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, a lot of public money going towards that. And don't get me wrong, I do think this is a good thing. It's a good trend that we've moved away from simply subsidising often destruction, actively subsidising destruction, to subsidising what should be restoration. From where the previous iterations of subsidies ended up subsidising the ploughing up of chalk grasslands, such as the one I showed you pictures of at the start, and the grubbing out of hedgerows and the cutting down of ancient woodlands and so on. But I do think there are some questions that need to be asked about the efficacy and the efficiency of stewardship schemes. Because if they're really so effective, why are we still in such an awful crisis today? Why are habitats and species still in decline? Why are only about 40% of our sites of special scientific interest actually in favourable condition, with the rest in unfavourable condition, 11% of them still declining? And I think there's a clear need for better accountability in how this money is spent, the strings that are attached to it, the enforcement action by the Rural Payments Agency and by Natural England. There's also, I think, a question here that comes up about, instead of simply renting environmental outcomes from private landowners, which is effectively what our system of farm payments is doing. You're renting an outcome from a landowner. You're not getting that outcome yourself. You're paying someone else to do it. In certain cases where that outcome clearly hasn't been delivered, after decades of environmental stewardship schemes being in place, and yet the SSI or the habitat is still in poor and declining condition, such as, for example, some of the grouse moors that I talk about in my book. There's a particular one owned by the Duke of Westminster, one of the biggest landowners in the country, that is still in declining condition after decades of public money being pumped into it. I would say there's an argument there that governments should be looking at, actually, why don't we just simply buy the land outright and give it to a public body or an environmental conservation organisation to manage? Maybe they would do a better job of it, and maybe it would be a much better value for money than having to continually pay stewardship payments over the decades and not get the results that we asked for. Okay, so incentives, kind of good, but need work. What's an alternative approach? Again, apologies, I'm not expecting you to read out all of these lines here. I will read out the key ones. But an alternative approach might be to look at the planning system. I mean, after all, it's kind of a system we've had for almost 80 years for governing certain decisions about how land is used in England. And when the Town and Country Planning Act was brought in 1947 by the post-war Attlee government, Labour government that came in then, it also represented quite a radical change in the rights of landowners. It meant that effectively the government had nationalised development rights over land, so that where previously a landowner had been able to build on their land, now you'd have to seek planning permission for doing so. And so could the planning system be used to drive nature recovery in the here and now? I mean, I think quite apart from the fact that the current government seems to hate the planning system with such a passion that it seems to think that it's the only thing that protects bats and newts and spiders, and it's blocking all forms of growth and stopping housing from being built. There's an even bigger problem, which is that actually agriculture and forestry, two of the biggest drivers of ecological decline in modern England, have never been part of the planning system. They're not deemed to be development, and so are not subject to planning permission. And this is why I've reproduced here the wording of the Town and Country Planning Act from 1947, as it says, the following operations or uses of land shall not be deemed for the purposes of this act to involve development. That is to say, subsection E, the use of any land for the purposes of agriculture or forestry. So, in other words, it's always been outside of the planning system. So, a local authority, a planning authority, makes determinations over the built environment, but not over the wider use of land for agriculture or forestry or shooting or indeed other things like that. And given that the built environment, and this is the other bit of this slide, given that the built environment in England is about 8.8% of the land, okay, add in, urban green space as well, takes you about 12.5%. But that's still only 12.5%. What about all of the other 80 to 90% of England? Well, all of that lies outside of the planning system. So we have a question of should we integrate decisions about agriculture and forestry into the planning system? That's something that people like Marion Shord, who was a fantastic forward thinker back in the 70s and 80s, still campaigning today, was sort of advocating back then. But that is so clearly outside of this government, and to be honest, any government's so far kind of desire to do that. That seems too radical to even happen. Okay, so enough of the gloom and doom. What should we do? What could we do to hold landowners to account and see more nature restored? Well, I want to give you 5 proposals for how we could make a difference. And the first is actually something that I hope we might get to see quite soon, because I have it on good intelligence that in the next fortnight, we will see the publication of the government's new land use framework. It's only been about 5 years in the making, but there we are. Hopefully it'll be good when it comes out. The land use framework is meant to be, and we'll obviously see what happens, it's meant to be the government's way of setting out a more rational use of land in England, kind of accepting that there are trade-offs, there's some land that is better suited for certain uses and not for others. For example, not all land is equally productive when it comes to producing food. And here is, gosh, that is quite an acid green when it comes out on the slides. this is a map that I've tried to make using data from the land use consultation that DEFRA held last year, where it shows you the most productive land in England in green, slightly less productive land in yellow, and the least productive land is shown there, coloured in black. And I've superimposed the boundaries of England's national parks over the top. So, and you can kind of see that although some of those areas that are least productive are obviously areas of built-up areas, cities and so on, a lot of them are also areas of the uplands, and also happen to be areas where we've designated them as national parks. There's also a bunch of national landscapes like the North Pennines that are not shown on there that are also in those areas of least productive land. So here is a kind of area where you might say, well, perhaps there is an opportunity here to be saying national parks really, really ought to be prioritising nature recovery. Perhaps we should even be giving that as one of the statutory purposes, one of the legal duties of national parks to be able to restore nature. And in doing so, that would be be accepting that there is a trade-off. It would be saying that food production in these areas, which has, of course, in previous decades been subsidised and incentivised by governments as kind of post-war drives for food production and intensive farming, by saying actually these are areas that actually, if we were honest about it, would be better for producing nature. They would be better for producing, allowing peat bogs to rejuvenate, to be re-wetted, for scrub and birch and temperate rainforests to regenerate, for heathland plants to bounce back from decades of overgrazing and so on. And obviously there are big conversations around what impact that would have culturally and on farmers' incomes and so on. But I think that we have to have, if we are going to have a serious conversation about nature restoration, we do have to accept that there could be some trade-offs, and in some parts of the country, nature does need to be given greater priority. What about another way? Well, it won't surprise you to hear that I think that we need to be opening up the land registry in order to have the cleansing benefit of sunlight cast onto the secrecy of land ownership. And actually, this is something where I'm quite hopeful of as well, because it's something we might see some hints of in the forthcoming land use framework. I'm hopeful of that. But it's something that ministers are starting to talk about. I've met with Matt Pennycook, who's the housing minister, who's responsible for the land registry. That just happens to be where it's placed within the government apparatus. He seems to be quite keen to see the land registry opened up and for more data on land ownership to be made available to the public for free. And I think that opening up data on who owns land will be incredibly helpful for loads of reasons. For one reason, it would actually help landowners and farmers themselves to make collaborations, to collaborate with each other and link up land holdings in order to apply for things like landscape recovery funding, one of the new forms of post-Brexit farm payment systems that are coming in, to create partnerships within river catchments, to coordinate natural flood management schemes and so on. But I think it would also be really helpful for the public at large to be able to see more about what's going on, to end this sort of archaic secrecy around who owns land, and to make it easier for civil society groups to campaign, to say, okay, we can now see that this entire watershed is owned by, X estates. What are they doing about it? What are they doing to stop the town downstream from flooding? And to start to build more accountability in that respect. Thirdly, I think we need to raise societal expectations on what major landowners should be doing for nature. And you might remember that earlier in my talk, I quoted former Environment Secretary Therese Coffey, as she was sort of talking about custodians of the countryside. Well, even Therese Coffey got this. She said back in 2023, we need to work faster on major landowners getting their land in a good state. So, I think she was right on that. And so I was also pleased to recently see that last year, the current government, starting to do more in this respect. They founded a new group called the National Estate for Nature, and it comprises landowners who own about 10% of England, so a decent chunk of it. And their members are a mix of public, private and third sector landowners, from the Ministry of Defence and the Forestry Commission, public sector, through to the water companies, obviously used to be publicly owned, since privatised. What are they doing with their land? Through to the National Trust, the Wildlife Trusts, kind of organisations that you would hope were already doing lots of good work with their land. But also, and I think this was really useful, 3 aristocratic estates. The Holcombe estate up in Norfolk, where you might have heard of the guy who is the land agent for it, Jake Fines. He's really great. He's written about the work he's done there. And Clinton Devon estates down in Devon, and Elsdon estate as well. And I think what that does is starts to kind of, the point of this group is to basically kind of start to raise the bar, I think, in terms of what is actually expected of major landowners when it comes to nature recovery. This group recently met and published their minutes saying that they are going to hold one another accountable. Well, I think we have some questions about that. I think we should all be holding them accountable. But in order to enable that, they would actually be publishing estate management plans, and that's forthcoming this April. So again, transparency, public scrutiny. Hopefully, these are kind of drivers of better performance in future. And I think that there's something else here about the fact that they invited in not just the public sector and kind of conservation groups who are perhaps already doing quite a lot already, but inviting in three private sector estates. I think it sort of raises a question of what are all the rest of them doing? What's the Duke of Westminster doing? What's the Earl of this and the Viscount of that? And what's James Dyson doing? What's Jeremy Clarkson doing? You know, all these sorts of questions. And I think that's good. That's starting to get a debate going. That's what we want to see, because I do think that ultimately this is about trying to create systems and processes by which more of us who care about how land is used and how nature is being destroyed or restored can actually participate in decisions over it. So lastly, I think the government should go further than this, because this is just the kind of top few landowners, the really big institutional landowners in most cases. But you know, as we talked about earlier, there's that kind of tier of maybe 2,500 or so landholdings that are massive, that control about a quarter of the farmland in England. Why not get them to report as well? And why not give it a catchy title, an ecological doomsday survey for the present day? You know, the original doomsday was about land ownership, about King William trying to get taxes from his subjects. But I think there's a far more pressing need today, and one that matches the imperatives of the 21st century, which is to find out how land is being used and to ask the major landowners what they are actually doing to restore nature. So I would argue that the government should be requiring all landowners of, you know, set a threshold, say 1,000 acres, 500 hectares, whatever, and pass regulations that that compel these landowners to publish, you know, a digitized map of their land. Maybe that could be just provided by the Land Registry if we're opening up that at the same time. A baseline ecological survey of what's going on their land at the moment, and a plan for what they're going to be doing to help meet some of these public goals around 30 by 30, carbon sequestration, species recovery, and so on. And the thing is that I'm not trying to just say, oh, let's just create loads more bureaucracy, because I'm sure that would be the kind of the cry of the Telegraph or, you know, the Daily Mail or whatever. But the fact is that estates of this size already have estate management plans. They're so big that they already have to have estate management plans. They will have land agents. They will have people who are doing this sort of work. It's just they won't, necessarily be public, and they won't necessarily be setting out what they're doing on nature recovery. In fact, some of them might not have any plans of doing so whatsoever. So green landowners, progressive landowners, the sorts of landowners that, you know, we might hear about quite a lot in the press, whether that's the Knepp estate and Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree doing rewilding down there, or, you know, other big estates doing great things. They'd probably find it really easy to do this because they've already got an estate management plan and they could just publish it. In fact, we were talking about this earlier, just when we were recording a podcast. There is, in fact, an estate in the Lake District, the Lowther estate, that has already just published a nature recovery plan. And so, you know, again, opening itself up to some extent to scrutiny, which is, you know, perhaps for landowners who haven't had that, the sort of the eyes of the public on them for centuries, that might be quite scary, quite a scary thing to have to endure. But I think that's good. I think that's part of modern society. I think that if we, but I think it's also about, you know, saying, well, more recalcitrant estates might balk at the prospect, but that's kind of really the point. It's saying actually, you know, landowning, the ownership of land ultimately should really be seen as a privilege rather than necessarily so much as a right. And that actually there is a social contract here about what are you doing to look after this land for the long term. If you want to call yourself a steward, great, just tell us what you're doing with it and what are you doing with the public money we're giving you as well. So I think that probably does for me. And it'd be quite good to go into a conversation and debate, and you can tell me how much you violently disagree with everything I've just said, or ask questions or whatever. or just just applaud if you want. But I should probably also just put in a commercial break to say, please buy my book as well. Thanks.
We can open up to questions. I'm sure there's plenty there to get your teeth into. So who would like to kick off? Joe?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Guy. Brilliant talk. Fantastic stuff. So one of the interesting things earlier on is you had your kind of private ownership, your kind of city bankers, your oligarchs, something like that.
Yep.
So I agree with all the kind of measures you proposed for how we go forward with this. But I wonder whether, to what extent would you be comfortable also with trying to encourage like return-seeking investments in nature for all those like really rich private landowners who might also find that a useful way for encouraging them to do nature conservation on their land or restoration? Are you comfortable with that? And if not, why not? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, are we going to just do one at a time? That probably is easiest for you to remember stuff.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, I think my question is where are those returns coming from? Because ultimately, if it was really profitable to keep nature intact or restore it, then I guess everybody would be doing it already, right? So we have to create those structures, those policies in place to either make it profitable or to compel that, that restoration. So, I'm intrigued by when there's lots of discussion about natural capital or, there's all this private investment that's just waiting to be invested in nature recovery. I'm a bit, well, why? Where's it coming from? Is it all coming from, a desire to do carbon offsets? In which case, well, are we basically just offsetting destruction elsewhere and pollution elsewhere? Is it coming from a desire for good PR? Okay, fair enough, sure. But I also think that alongside the good PR for the good guys, you do have to have a bit of bad PR for the bad guys so that we don't keep just having, huge amounts of nature destruction going on. I guess, I mean, ultimately, if we're talking about public subsidies, then, yes, that is making the economics hopefully stack up more to be able to keep nature intact and to restore it. I probably think that some governments try and overthink how to avoid doing stuff that challenges certain kind of, I guess you would call them neoliberal models of doing things. And that, rather than necessarily having to come up with some incredibly complicated, I don't know, biodiversity net gain metric or some, really complicated nature market or offsetting market for carbon that is clearly full of holes around the world, then why don't we just reach for some of the other forms of institution or structures that we have used in the past for policies in other areas? Why don't we just use the state? Why don't we look to reinvent the commons? Why don't we reach for democracy? I mean, these are all human constructs, right? The market is just another human construct. So it might be very efficient at doing certain things, but I don't know if it's really proven itself yet for nature restoration. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, Guy. I'm from Denmark, and Denmark and England share some things in terms of these questions. One of the things is sort of before you left the EU, we were together sort of in last place in terms of nature.
Solidarity.
Now we're last
Solidarity.
Alone now. So thanks for that. But in terms of land ownership, Denmark looks very different because throughout sort of the 17th and 18th century, we had sort of abolishment of serfdom and then redistribution. Sort of all the commons got chopped up, and instead of a landed gentry, we have private ownership of sort of obviously farms that still grow in size, but it looks very different. And I wanted to maybe challenge you on this idea that this sort of very unequal distribution of land in England is necessarily a blockade going forward, because what we experience now in Denmark is that there are some big initiatives to find more land for nature now, but as soon as you draw a big polygon anywhere in Denmark, instead of capturing 17 huge estates, you capture 6,000 estates, and you have to talk with each one. And 80% of them, even though they own just a couple of hectares, are conservative, old, and they don't want to, they want to play. And that is actually a huge issue for the Danish government. Whereas right now it seems like it has more luck with the few, some, obviously not all, but some large sort of rich people that own a lot of land get a fun idea and they want to try nature. And that's actually some of the most exciting nature projects in Denmark that we see right now.
Yeah. I think it's a very fair challenge. I think that clearly, throughout the 20th century, there was a massive intensification of agriculture that was, the primary driver of nature loss in England, as I'm sure it was in Denmark. And, that clearly cut across, divisions of ownership and so on. I guess that I think that perhaps in opening up questions about ownership and private property rights, I do think it gets to a certain fundamental core of why we have a nature crisis. I mean, ultimately, I think I want to kind of raise questions about the sort of weirdness of owning land in itself at all, or why that's not sort of vested in, a kind of trust for forever, or vested in the public sector and therefore essentially belonging to all of us and being subject to democratic decision making. So yeah, I mean, I think this is the context I guess I'm most familiar with, and I guess that the kind of contrast to you obviously rightly say that there's clearly a lot of people who are very unhappy therefore about trying to put lines on maps. Nevertheless, I do think there has obviously been an extremely powerful landowning lobby in England that has absolutely often been at loggerheads with nature conservation right from the outset. I mean, in the book, I try and trace this back to the very foundations of what the academic Matthew Kelly calls the nature state in England, and it's the kind of creation of things like Natural England as it is now, the Nature Conservancy as it was then, kind of one of the first green regulators, and how it came up against straight away the fact that not only were there big landowners who didn't want them to start designating nature reserves around the country, but those same landowners were literally in the cabinet of the Tory government that was running the country at the time. So I do think there is this, in this country at least, there is this kind of relationship between land and money and power that goes back a long way and does help to explain some of the decisions that have been made. But I totally take your challenge.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask if you could just speak a bit more to the idea of opening up the land registry and what you meant by that. And I think at the land registry, there are land certificates that record the owners. They might record a little bit of the history of the land, but what were you actually thinking opening up would mean? Would there be more information available, and how would you take that forward? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the question, if people didn't hear it, was about what do I mean by opening up the land registry and what sort of information would be available. So in some ways, the government has started to make moves down this road already. And in fact, it was nearly 10 years ago now that they released more information on corporate land holdings in England and Wales. So they released a set of data sets for land owned by offshore companies and land owned by companies and other corporate bodies registered in the UK. And that essentially involved them releasing some vast data sets, kind of 3 million entries or so, with basically addresses of the owner, the parcel of land, the address of the land, and then who owned that in terms of which company or which public body or whatever. So, I thought that was useful information. It wasn't as useful as it could have been because it wasn't joined to a specific land parcel. It was divorced from the maps that I think are really crucial if you're wanting to do spatial analysis of environmental issues or what have you. So I think that's one thing that would be better if they could re-release that information with kind of the spatial coordinates attached, and that would make it a lot more useful. But I also think that there's a very strong public interest in releasing that information for example, for land parcels over a certain area, regardless of the owner, because I think that's something where I completely understand that there are legitimate privacy concerns. I don't want anybody to be able to go and search someone's name in the land registry, and then go, ah, I know where Joe Bloggs lives. I'm going to go and, you know, stalk him now or whatever, or commit fraud or whatever. Absolutely out of the question, I think. What you need to do, I think, is, as a guard against that, is just say, okay, right, let's have a threshold. Let's say everything over a certain area and size of land parcel, we will release that, but keep everything that is the size of a house or the size of a residential land parcel off limits. Or you do that by combining it with OS mouse map or address book or whatever, the various other data sets that you could identify residential addresses by. And actually, I think what you'd find is that around 95% of the land parcels in the land registry are probably about under, I did look this up, about half a hectare. That's pretty much all of the residential addresses, but 95% of the land by area is in parcels that are far bigger than that. So you could release that, and I think you're getting a long way towards both understanding who owns land, but also protecting people's legitimate concerns about privacy and fraud. Where to start?
So this question, it sort of follows up on the Denmark-England comparison there, but sort of at the other end of the scale. What are there best practice models of land ownership and management that we could follow that would be the best for supporting nature or nature recovery, etc.?
Best practice models. I mean, for one thing, I guess, you know, ultimately we need to learn from, you know, any nature reserve around the world that's doing better than ours. I mean, that would be a good place to start. Looking at national parks in other countries as well is, I think, a good place to draw comparisons with our how our own are faring. And, you know, I go into some detail in the book about how kind of pathetic our national parks are compared to many around the world. They just, you know, I completely acknowledge they have a very different history. I also acknowledge there's a very checkered history to the whole idea of national parks around the world, how many of them were set up essentially expropriating land from indigenous peoples. No question about that. But in terms of delivery for nature, it is also true that many of them are doing a rather lot better than, you know, some of the things that we call national parks in this country. And I think that, you know, it does have to kind of, again, it has to contend with the fact that we continue to allow intensive forms of agriculture in many parts of our national parks and indeed in some of our, you know, SSIs and nature reserves as well. I think in terms of other forms of land ownership, I mean, I feel under-travelled in terms of understanding other European countries' approach to this, and it was really interesting to hear about the situation in Denmark. In the book, I do look at quite a lot into Scotland and, you know, how actually even within the UK we have a very different set of laws and rules just over the border from England, and how little we pay attention to that often, how little we pay attention to Scottish politics or indeed Welsh politics or politics of Northern Ireland. And I think that, and when it comes to land, I think that's a very interesting set of conversations to be plugged into more and to be thinking about. And obviously in Scotland over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a much more vibrant debate about land reform, about what land is for, who owns it, why, what does it do, what common good purpose does it deliver on. And again, I'm by no means saying that everything is rosy north of the border. Clearly, Scotland is both also still facing a nature crisis and has huge concentration of land ownership, but they also do have certain laws and processes in place that are starting to address some of those things, I think, whether that's community right to buy or discussions about access to land and a right to responsible access, which I think are very interesting and ones that I hope we ultimately end up having a similar debate in England.
Thanks so much. It's such a cool talk. So one thing was I was expecting your talk to be angrier. So you're obviously a very, very prominent activist, and your books have got these. I mean, the Lie of the Land. You know, the chapter where you discover, for example, like the pheasant pit, right? You know, that chapter seethes with anger. So my question is, like, firstly, from your experience, what have been your biggest activist successes, right, and why? And is there anything more that we can do to harness like public anger towards this? Are we angry enough, basically?
I can be angrier, but I sort of felt in the sort of, you know, august settings of Oxford University, I should tone it down a bit and, you know, provide some evidence for what I'm saying. But no, I agree. Of course, there's, yeah. I mean, I think the thing is though, I also think that I just want us to actually win. I don't want us to just be angry about this stuff and kind of say, oh, well, let's just take it all back or something like that, and then nothing changes, because we don't actually contend with the fact that, not only are these private property rights that go back over 1,000 years, but there is also understandable constraints around some of this stuff. I don't want to live in a society where the government can just simply expropriate the land with no due process around it. I don't want to live in that sort of society. I think you have to, when you have discussions about land reform, you do have to think about, as Scotland has done, how you make it compatible with things like the Human Rights Act, or the European Convention on Human Rights and the right to property. So I think you have to have those sorts of discussions grounded in reality, grounded in what the current situation is as well. But in terms of success, I don't know if I've had any yet on this. I mean, I think there's been these sort of tentative moves that I'm talking about are encouraging around things like just those sort of basic things like transparency and opening up the land registry. I'm astonished that perhaps the Right to Roam campaign hasn't got further than it has, because I thought that was the kind of low-hanging fruit, really, that it was like, can you at least give us a bit more space to walk in around the countryside? That was the sort of the land issue that would appeal to most politicians and to most governments, and that we would see progress on it. But sadly, despite the Labour Party promising before they got into government that they would have a right to roam in England, or a right of responsible access in England, like they have had in Scotland, they U-turned on that before they drew up their manifesto. And so, we've been trying. It's been an uphill struggle, I think, to try and get them to actually see sense and start to engage on questions of access reform since they got into office. So, actually, one of the things that I think is come forward most, but perhaps very few people still seem to be aware of, is that there is actually going to be a community right to buy in England. It's been snuck in through the English Devolution Bill, which I think is still going through Parliament at the moment, or nearly completed its passage through Parliament. There's stuff in it that I think certainly won't be as radical as the community right to buy that exists in Scotland, but we will actually have more powers now as community groups to be able to say, great, we get a right of first refusal on this asset if we've registered our interest in it, and so on. So I think there's things where people will be able to actually have the tools available to them to actually do more of this sort of stuff in the future. But it won't be a surprise to you that I think that this government is absolutely terrible at telling a narrative about anything. Even the good stuff that it is doing is absolutely terrible at telling any sort of story. It's certainly not telling a story of land reform, which is a shame, because the first Labour government of Scotland told a fantastic story about land reform, and actually that helped, obviously, to get lots of people interested in and getting involved in doing community buyouts. So yeah, there's still a long way to go, but the more people that get involved, then the better.
Just to follow up on that point, both with the right to roam, why was there a U-turn? You'd think the Labour government is less than hock with large conservative landowners, and why also previous Labour governments? Why have we seen until some of these early steps that you're seeing talking about?
Yeah.
Have we seen reluctance on the left to address these issues historically?
I think we know from what the NFU themselves, the National Farmers Union themselves, boasted after the 2024 election, is they said that one of their proudest moments was getting rid of right to roam out of the Labour Party manifesto. So again, there's that power of the sort of landowning and farming lobby. But I do think that Labour, and particularly the current incarnation of Labour, is quite it's quite urban centric in how it thinks. I don't think it thinks in terms of land, or if it thinks about the countryside, it just reaches for pick up the phone to the NFU, and that they clearly represent the entirety of the spectrum of opinion amongst farmers and people who live in the countryside. Clearly not true. So I think there is that, but I also think that it's been a long time since questions of land ownership and access and so on have been really on the political agenda. It's not something that has been really kind of contested since perhaps even the decline of the Liberal Party at the start of the 20th century, when Lloyd George was literally brought in a land value tax. It didn't go very well because World War I intervened, but there was that whole movement back then that was kind of very, very radical for compared to what we have today. And land has gone off the agenda in that respect. But I think, in terms of nature conservation and the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, this is where I think we have to have some of those conversations again. And I think it's through that, and perhaps through questions of access and transparency, there might be some changes afoot in future.
Hey, can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'm glad you don't get angry. Well, you do, but I think it's how do we get like a younger generation, okay, to really fight this cause, and to understand how do we bring the things together. For example, we've got landowners and we've got this initiative to plant whatever it is, 30,000 hectares a year of woodland. Okay, you go out, you see all these things planted with whatever it is, 200 million plastic guards over the last few years. Everybody thinks, oh yeah, we check at all these trees being planted. There's not one that I've looked at that does not have the taproots that are bound or pruned, and we're planting thousands of these things. What generational equity are we leaving for the future? How do we get people to listen to you like a greater mass, if that makes sense? Because there's so much that's just not being. It's like we're seeing these things. You talked about it so well. We give these payments to pay for this stuff, but yet the groundwork, things like road effect zone, the increased road effect is having damage to the environment, and people aren't picking up on these nuances. And I'm just not seeing like a younger generation really getting involved enough, and people who are out on the land recognizing like the triple SIs degrading.
So I think so something
make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, something I didn't really pick up on in this talk, but I usually would emphasize is that there are loads of organizations that you can get involved with. There's loads of activist groups you can get involved with. There's Wildcard, for example. Wildcard is very much a young group, both in terms of kind of the activists who are involved with it, but also relatively recently founded. Its entire focus is on challenging some of the biggest landowners in the country to do more for nature on their land. So they've challenged the Church of England. They've delivered petitions to the church commissioners. They're trying to get General Synod, which is the kind of body that governs the Church of England, to pass a motion to commit to 30 by 30. They're trying to do all sorts of stuff around the Duchy of Cornwall, which is one of the royal estates. Yeah. So they're doing great stuff. There's loads of stuff that's being done by World Justice, the group set up by Chris Packham, Ruth Tingay and Mark Avery, which does loads of stuff to, challenge, use legal challenges to push the government to do more things on like pheasant shooting, to regulate pheasant shoots better. Again, I didn't really talk about that in this presentation, but yeah, I mean that's another huge area around better regulating game bird shoots, and how the huge impacts that they're having on the countryside. But I think, and they've had success. They've actually had quite a lot of success in recent years in getting certain forms of regulation brought in through some of these legal challenges. So there is lots that can be done. You could join Friends of the Earth. Talk to Chris behind you.
Thanks. That was appropriate. But what I wanted to there's a real split in a lot of this debate between the urban and the rural, and a bunch of people in the urban areas who want the change, who are reading your books and haven't a clue how to get going. And I think that's what you're saying. There's a real challenge. But the one thing you touched on, which does seem to bring together people looking at more sustainable urban living and suburban living and rural living, is land value and taxation. And there's been a lot of groups in the urban regeneration area who are seeing that as being one of the only ways of actually delivering affordable housing and so on. Would you say that was an area we could focus on? Is that something you looked at?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I'd like someone who is a better economist than me to explain how it would have an impact for reasons of conservation. I'm not saying that land value tax isn't, economically efficient and great for things like urban densification, and obviously has, great benefits in terms of equity, in terms of capturing some of the wealth of people who happen just to own land. But I'm not quite sure how it would necessarily, apart from incentivizing denser, medium density building in urban areas, I don't know quite what it would mean from a kind of ecological nature perspective. It could have benefits. I guess the other thing that I tried to, I've been very conscious with writing my books that there is a group of people who call themselves Georgists, who are followers of Henry George, the original advocate of land value tax. And I think they're very well-meaning and they have some great arguments, but I do think that and there may be a Georges here in the room, but I do sometimes think that they get a little bit obsessed with just this. It's a kind of a single issue thing that's the salvation of everything is bound up in land value tax, and I think it's probably not. It may have been more of a sensible proposal at the end of the 19th century when taxes in the state were generally lower, but I think LVT is not the panacea. But I do think, I agree, I think you're right that it would be great to see more discussion between perhaps rural and urban groups about what that would look like. I mean, I guess also, just one last thought of it, is obviously rural land values are obviously way, way lower than urban land values. So in terms of actually where you're getting you're kind of taking your tax, you're probably going to end up, taxing urban land rather more.
Oxfordshire is obviously rather different.
Right.
Because the pressure's on land around here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going from rural to urban.
Instantly.
Well, pretty rapidly.
Yeah, yeah. Right, I see. Sorry, I see what you mean. Yes. Yeah, good point.
Thanks so much for the talk. And I think I wouldn't necessarily agree with some of your previous argument as in how small the pixel of land use in the UK is, because I do geospatial analysis. But put that aside, I'm a bit curious about saying, like, in the case if the land registration is all open, that we figure out no matter how small the land parcel is, it has ownership attached to it. So what do you say in this ideal scenario? How does that feed into the current kind of policy? What do you see this goes? If your argument is saying like land ownership is sort of hindering that we reach the target 30 by 30. So ideal situation, every piece of land will figure out its ownership. So what potentially going to be the next step looks like? And then I think I have a following question from previously. It's like, so in currently the National England's Green Infrastructure Network, and you're looking at a data set, you're looking through the whole of England, the situation is there's not much land doesn't have a tag onto it. So realistically, what one can change is regeneration project, because this country only have 15 national parks, as I recently passed the Life in the UK test. You can't create another national park. There's not much land for that. So the regeneration is a way to go. And the BNG is a tool to help with that. So in your ideal situation, if everything land ownership is being registered, where is going to go then?
So I think if I understand your question correctly, I think what I'm trying to say is that ultimately, because obviously land is fixed, it is, it's the North Pennines are the North Pennines. You're not going to kind of create another North Pennines over here, particularly when you're talking about things like all the peat soils in the country. They're obviously geographically fixed. You're not going to create them anytime. They're irreplaceable. You have to protect them and restore them. And therefore, ultimately, spatially, who owns that land does have an impact on how it is used. And we can try and say to those, we can say, oh, well, we don't care about who owns it. We're just going to put a blanket kind of like draw a designation around it and try and protect it as best as we can. But you still have to contend with private property rights in that, because the people there still own that land, and Natural England or whoever the regulator is, or the Environment Agency, or whatever, will still have to deal with the fact that they might have some angry people who own that land, some of them being potentially very rich and powerful and able to hire lots of lawyers and so on, saying, no, you can't infringe on my property rights. I'm not going to look after that in the way you say. I'm going to carry on doing what I want to with it. So I think that's kind of the point I'm trying to make. And, ultimately, you don't need to know who owns every house in the country in order to drive nature recovery. But I think you do need to know for certain, if you're coming up with 30 by 30, or if you're trying to say that actually in certain parts of the country, we really should be sparing land or prioritizing that land for nature, I think it's part of the understanding of what are the systems that are driving the existing, the destruction of nature currently, and what could underpin future recovery. I'm not quite sure. So I think your point about the national parks is, I certainly wouldn't advocate creating another national park in England or necessarily anywhere in Britain at the moment, because I don't think the existing ones work very well, because they're not doing enough for nature recovery. I absolutely agree that we need to be sorting out, for example, the government should be doing what it's actually publicly said it will do, which is to update the legal purposes of national parks in England to include nature recovery. It said that at the end of 2024, and it still hasn't actually passed a bill doing so. So that's a really simple thing that it could be doing. It could actually make some time available in the next King's Speech and the next set of legislation it seeks to pass. But at the moment, I don't see the government putting anywhere near the priority on nature that it should be, apart from when it wants to talk about getting rid of newts and bats because supposedly they're a block on growth. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Guy, for a very interesting talk. I am in the process of reading your book, so I've got a few of your facts in there. My view of it, and I come from not a farming background, but I'm in touch with groups in the North Chilterns, which is having some great success, we feel, of getting collaboration between farm holdings. And it's actually based on some DEFRA funding, a little bit of seed funding, under the farming protected landscapes, because we're within the Chilterns National Landscapes area. And all it's doing really is getting to farmers who individually are, many of them, I know you're quite dismissive of farmers in your book, perhaps unfairly so. And I take your point about the NFU, maybe they've got the wrong tack really in claiming this custodianship, some right, God-given right to actually manage it on behalf of the nation. But individually, farmers, and you talk about the land ownership of those large estates, the majority of those are farmed. I think 60 to 80% of those larger estates are still farmed, many of which are farmed under successional tenancies.
Yep.
So where you have got continuity within the farming families, albeit now under pressure with things like inheritance tax payments. So that continuity may not exist in the future. So maybe some change in land holding ownership would need to be considered. But coming back to the collaboration, just with very modest amount of input, doing carbon surveys, doing annual bird surveys, doing environmental ecological support for groups creating ponds on farms. The farmers themselves will contribute largely to that. And it only takes a little bit of money, extra money, and collaboration and communication between those groups. Farmers are very sociable people, and they all want to do the right thing. And the other thing I would mention is that we had post-war, we had the industrialization of farming. It's often referred to by journalists. And actually, that's a generation that's now passing. And if you go to an event like Groundswell every year, it's been going for 10 years, you've got the next generation, and they're into grass-based systems. They're into regenerative farming. So they want to do the right things. They do not want to do what their parents did, which is to be slaves to the likes of supermarkets and produce farming for the nation at cost. So I think the start point, and I'm very interested in your slide about the national parks, we are not funding the national parks or DEFRA through RPA and things like the Natural England, anywhere like. And the point you made in the book is that national parks having to sell off land to make ends meet. That's going completely the opposite direction. So I think there are one or two start points, some seed funding to get farmers to do the right thing, fund the institutions we have already in a much better way. And I think we will start to see results. I'm certainly glad it wasn't an angry presentation, because I think confrontation is not the way forward. At the end of the day, we have to square this economically as a nation. There's only so much money that can fall onto public purse, because we know we're already at the limit. So,
well, look, I really welcome. Maybe we talk more afterwards about the specifics of the projects, because I'd be interested in hearing more about them. But I think I to be fair to me, I do talk about the good stuff that is in the book, but I also say there are lots of other books out there, some of them written by farmers and landowners themselves, like James Rebanks or Isabella Tree or whatever. So I didn't want to write that book again, or I could have just gone and interviewed people doing the right thing already. I wanted to talk about the fact that there is still a big problem, and we do still need to do a lot more. And so some of that is about trying to encourage and cajole people to do more. But also the reason perhaps why I'm perhaps so rude about the NFU, National Farmers Union, is because they literally lobbied against the landscape recovery projects of which you're kind of talking about, because they wanted to see money for farmers everywhere for doing less. you know, that they want to see the money. They absolutely want to see money, public money for farmers, but they'd be much happier if it had fewer strings attached. And I think, as a taxpayer, as we all are, you know, that actually there does need to be some strings attached to what goes on with those public funds. And I would say that actually the landscape recovery projects are some of the more encouraging kind of forms of funding out there, because they do encourage collaboration between farmers and landowners, tenants and freehold owners across larger areas, across catchments, across rivers, across, you know, areas of moorland or whatever, to collaborate and to do slightly more ambitious things that they perhaps couldn't do just on their own. But you know, that's kind of why I have a go at the lobby, where I'm not trying to have a go at absolutely every single farmer or landowner in the country, as much as perhaps some of them think that I am.
So many questions, but I'm afraid I think.
No.
And then I changed my mind because I got nervous, and then I came back again. But I really enjoy your work and appreciated this talk. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
For a bit of positionality, I work with Scottish community landowners on their land management plans. So I'm coming a bit from that angle, and appreciate the reference to Scotland. And I think if there's another lesson to be taken from Scotland, there's a real risk when we're talking about rewarding good or green large landowners through further PES payments or further subsidies or carbon credits and biodiversity credits, that what you end up with in effect is large landowners who've accumulated astronomical amounts of wealth through histories of ecological destruction, then are rewarded with further astronomical wealth for changing what they've done, but the underlying distribution of benefits and who has a say in what happens to the land doesn't actually change. And in Scotland, that's been a huge barrier to further progress. So are there instances when you're looking for these examples of good landowners that could be modeled off in England, that there's a more kind of multidimensional justice version of that you've seen?
Not yet. That's why I mostly look to Scotland to try and kind of provide a portal for England to actually see a different future or a different approach. I'm sure there are. I'm sure there's plenty of interesting examples out there. I guess I would say if there are, I guess I'd be looking for more examples of, you know, estates that perhaps involve communities in their management plans. Is there? Great.
Community ownership for the first one.
Oh, Hardwick. Yes, I know Hardwick. Yeah, I know Hardwick well. Yes, I love it. Absolutely amazing place. Yes, so there you go. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, yeah. I just think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? About and obviously there you have, you know, an enlightened existing owner kind of ceding to the community that obviously has grown up there. But I mean, is that replicable? Will that happen in many other places? I don't know. That's why I'm like, we need more tools to be able to do that. And, you know, even if it's just, you know, I look at things like there's been this huge amount of work being done by councils at the moment to create local nature recovery strategies. And I was just looking at the one by Lancashire, just randomly the one by Lancashire the other day, and pretty much everywhere in Lancashire, they've kind of drawn on a map saying, this could be useful for nature. It's like, great, it could be, but what are you actually going to do to then drive the decisions on the ground? Like, how's that actually going to have a change? How's that going to change things? And I think that's where I'm just like, I'm really interested in how, instead of having to spend years getting involved in a process like that with your authority, how can we get involved in decision-making that actually leads to a proper decision? You know, rather than being distracted by things that are kind of bureaucracies that have been set up to kind of tell us to go away. So if there are, more examples of estates that you come across or land holdings that you come across that are doing more to kind of involve people and involve communities in a kind of model of Scotland or getting towards that, I'd be really interested in hearing.
Okay, Great.
Okay.
Judging by the number of hands, we could carry on for another hour.
Well,
but
I'm still here.
we'll
I'm
give
hanging
you-
around afterwards.
We have drinks
we can
around the
chat
corner,
afterwards.
so
Yeah.
do come around and have an informal conversation and,
Yeah,
and,
do.
and chat.
Yeah.
Right, but thank you.
Thanks for great questions.